Today, exactly half a century after his passing, correspondent Rita Braver looks back on the life and times of our 36th president, Lyndon B. Johnson.
We've heard much about Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the most controversial presidents in American history. But there's a story that has never been fully told. The story of the powerful woman behind him, Alice Glass. For 25 years, she was more than just a mistress, an advisor. She was the mind, the heart, the iron will that steered LBJ from an unknown congressman to the head of the White House. His decisions were her decisions. His success was her success. However, fate has a cruel twist. Just as Johnson's power reached its zenith, the bond between them tragically severed. The woman who had dedicated her life to building him up ultimately turned her back, or perhaps even delivered the fatal blow to everything they had created. Who was Alice Glass to wield such influence, and what mystery has buried their relationship in the shadows of history? Alice Glass, the ice goddess of Langley. Alice Glass was not the image of a typical woman from the 1930s. She was not seeking a quiet life as a wife and mother. Instead, Alice embodied a spirit of intellectual rebellion and a fierce ambition, all contained within a body of breathtaking beauty. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, a height that made her tower over most women of her time, and her skin was a flawless, milky white, contrasted by her immaculate golden hair, which she wore pinned up with precision. Dressed in an elegant silk gown, her posture was perfect and still, making her resemble a living Greek statue, yet one infused with an unyielding will to ascend. Born and raised in Marlin, Texas, a small, hot, and suffocating town from a very young age, Alice was determined to escape the limited destiny set for women there. Using her sharp intellect and stunning looks as her primary tools, she forged a path out by marrying Charles Marsh, a wealthy and powerful media tycoon 23 years her senior. Marsh adored her completely and built for her the magnificent Langley estate, a 1,000-acre palace that she transformed into a cultural and political salon, a gathering place for some of America's most brilliant minds. At Langley, Alice reigned as a queen, orchestrating lavish parties and guiding intelligent discussions that left every man in the room admiring her. She possessed everything that money and status could provide, from fine jewelry and designer clothes to priceless works of art. Yet, amidst the sounds of clinking glasses, sophisticated laughter, and endless praise, she felt a profound and overwhelming emptiness. Alice had everything, but her heart yearned for a true fire, an energy powerful enough to challenge her mind and ignite her cool, controlled soul. She stood there, a goddess in her own palace, silently waiting for a storm to arrive. The fateful meeting in 1937. When two storms collide, that storm arrived in 1937. Lyndon B. Johnson walked into Langley for the first time, and he was unlike any guest Alice had ever entertained. He was a tall, thin man with unusually large ears, and his suit was wrinkled and looked inexpensive. However, he radiated a frenzied, almost chaotic energy, and his eyes burned with a raw, undisguised ambition. He moved and spoke with a relentless urgency, as if he were in a constant race against time to conquer the world. Alice Glass observed him carefully from across the dining table, where her husband, Charles Marsh, and Lyndon's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, were engaged in pleasant conversation about routine political matters. Alice heard none of it because her entire attention was fixed on the young man from Texas. She recognized something instantly, a quality that set him apart from the other politicians who sought her husband's favor. This man was not just another politician. He was a force of nature. A clear thought formed in her mind. This is a man of dreams meant for other people. Then, the moment happened. In the middle of the noise and chatter, Lyndon's eyes met Alice's across the room. Not a single word was spoken between them, but the connection was electric and absolute. It was the collision of two powerful storms, one of ice and one of fire, pulling each other into a vortex. The world around them seemed to dissolve, and Charles Marsh and Lady Bird, sitting right beside them, became mere background characters in a drama that now had only two main actors. In that single, silent exchange, an unspoken pact was made. Alice Glass, the Ice Queen of Long Lee, made a decision that would alter her life, his career, and the course of American history. She thought to herself, "I will shape this raw diamond into a legend." The secret architecture of a 25-year affair. Their relationship began almost immediately, and it was intense, passionate, and kept in absolute secrecy. They constructed a brilliant and elaborate system of concealment, using Long Lee itself as their primary stage. The mansion became the setting for a strange, perfect family performance. Lyndon and Lady Bird became frequent guests, often staying for weeks at a time. The four of them, Alice, her husband Charles, Lyndon, and his wife Lady Bird, would dine together, take walks on the estate grounds together, and discuss politics together. To the outside world, they were simply the closest of friends, with Charles Marsh serving as the most important financial and political patron of Lyndon's rising career. No one dared to speak the truth that was unfolding right before their eyes. For Alice, this double life was a source of constant, private pain. She had to play the role of the gracious hostess, smiling politely at Lady Bird, the woman her lover publicly called his wife. Yet, she was also the only person in the world who saw the real Lyndon B. Johnson, the one who confided in her his deepest fears, his wildest ambitions, and the vulnerable weaknesses he hid from everyone else. The ache of the deception was always present, but it was balanced by the unique sense of power and the profound connection she shared only with him. They carved out a private world for themselves in the heart of this grand deception. Their secret meetings took place in the deep shadows of Long Lee's vast library, surrounded by towering shelves of books, where Lyndon would tell her about his political battles in Washington, and Alice would provide him with sharp, strategic advice. They exchanged letters filled with both love and political plans, written in a code and delivered by a trusted friend. They lived in a state of permanent tension, fueled by the feeling that, as they once said, "We are living the only real life between two fake lives." Their love was nourished by secrecy, and the danger of that secrecy only made their bond stronger. The Pygmalion effect: how Alice sculpted a president. When Alice first met Lyndon in 1937, he was a raw, uncut stone of a man. He possessed immense natural talent and boundless ambition, but he completely lacked refinement and sophistication. He spoke too loudly, his manners were coarse, and his approach to politics relied on intimidation and brute force. Alice saw the incredible potential hidden beneath the rough exterior and began her project of sculpting him. Their relationship was more than just a love affair. It was a creative endeavor, a mission to shape a man into a leader. She started by teaching him the most basic things, showing him how to wear a suit that fit properly and how to choose the right tie. She corrected his rough Texas accent, teaching him to speak more slowly and deliberately, and to use charm and persuasion instead of just shouting to get his way. Alice opened up an entirely new world for Lyndon, a world of culture, art, and literature that he had never known. She made him read books, from ancient philosophers to modern novelists, and introduced him to the power of classical music. There were evenings at Long Lee when Lyndon B. Johnson, the man who would one day command the United States Senate with an iron will, sat quietly like a schoolboy beside Alice. He listened to a Mozart symphony for the very first time in his life, and his eyes, which usually blazed with ambition, now shone with a new kind of wonder and understanding. Alice did not just change his external appearance. She conducted a revolution within his soul. It was she who planted in his mind the progressive ideals of social justice and the importance of using power to help the poor and the marginalized. Alice was the one who gave him the foundational ideas that would later blossom into his historic Great Society programs. He was, in many ways, her creation. Why Alice never left. The sacred promise in the dark. Many have wondered why a woman as intelligent, beautiful, and wealthy as Alice Glass would accept the role of a secret mistress for 25 long years. Her sister later offered a simple explanation, stating, "Alice was madly in love with Lyndon. He was the greatest love of her life." But love alone does not explain her unwavering devotion. There was something deeper, a sacred promise that had bound her destiny to his forever. One hot summer night in 1938, as they stood together on the long porch of Longlee, looking out at the rolling hills bathed in moonlight, Lyndon did something he had never done before. He knelt on one knee before Alice. He did not propose marriage. Instead, he made a solemn vow. He told her, "You are the only fire that lights my way. When I reach the height of power, I will not just change America, I will change it for you. I will create an America where a woman like you no longer has to live in the shadows. On that day, I will acknowledge you before the entire world, and we will write a new chapter of history, not with power, but with love and justice." That promise became the invisible chain that bound Alice's heart. She believed in it with every fiber of her being. From that moment forward, she no longer saw herself as a mere mistress, but as a co-creator, a secret partner on a grand and noble mission. Accepting her hidden role was no longer a sign of weakness, it became a profound sacrifice. She was willing to endure the lies and the endless waiting to help Lyndon become a beacon of hope for millions of disadvantaged people. She believed their love was greater than social conventions, more important even than the title of husband and wife. In 1940, Alice officially married Charles Marsh, an act she privately considered a white flag of surrender to reality, a necessary arrangement to maintain their cover. But her heart and soul remained completely devoted to Lyndon and the sacred promise he had made to her under the moonlit sky. The Senate years, the swelling ego, and the silent cracks. Lyndon B. Johnson entered the Senate and rapidly became an unstoppable force, eventually rising to the position of Senate Majority Leader, where his power was nearly absolute. It was during this time that he perfected his legendary method of persuasion, known as the Johnson treatment. He would physically corner other senators, using his large frame to intimidate them, his face just inches from theirs, his voice shifting from a threatening whisper to a booming shout to a flattering plea, until they finally agreed to his demands. He became the undisputed master of the Senate. From her vantage point at Longlee, Alice watched this transformation with a growing sense of unease. The raw diamond she had so carefully polished had now become a giant. But in the process, his ego seemed to have expanded so much that it was devouring the very soul she had worked to nurture. The man who had once sat in silence listening to Mozart was now consumed only with vote counts, backroom deals, and the total submission of his opponents. Their first real arguments began to erupt during his visits to Longlee, and they were no longer intellectual debates, but bitter confrontations. Alice criticized his Johnson treatment, calling him a cruel bully and telling him he was betraying the very ideals they had once shared. Lyndon was no longer the eager student. He would listen to her in silence, but his eyes held a cold, resentful anger. He no longer needed her guidance, for he now possessed real, tangible power of his own. The first cracks in their 25-year relationship began to appear, small but deep and impossible to repair. The vice presidency, the widening cracks. In 1960, Lyndon B. Johnson accepted the nomination to run as vice president alongside John F. Kennedy. Their ticket won the election, but for Johnson, the victory felt like a personal humiliation. He had gone from being the all-powerful master of the Senate to being the number 2 man, a largely ceremonial role serving under a young, glamorous, and widely adored president. Lyndon felt small, powerless, and looked down upon by Kennedy's circle of Harvard-educated intellectuals. This deep-seated frustration and resentment poisoned all of his relationships, including his bond with Alice. He grew more irritable, suspicious, and distant, and his visits to Longlee became less frequent. Their phone calls grew shorter and were mostly filled with his complaints and grievances. For the first time in their long affair, Alice began to feel a cold, hard truth. She was no longer his partner and his guiding light. She had become a liability. In the highly scrutinized environment of the White House, a secret, decades-long affair was a political time bomb waiting to explode. Lyndon, a man obsessed with control, started to see Alice as the one element he could not manage. Their love, which had once been his greatest source of strength, was now his greatest vulnerability. The distance growing between them was not just geographical, it was psychological. He was building a wall around himself for protection. And Alice found herself standing on the outside. The breaking point, the Vietnam War. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One. He had finally reached the pinnacle of power that he and Alice had dreamed of for so long. But the path to that peak was paved with national tragedy, and the immense power he now wielded would lead him into a final, irreconcilable conflict with the woman he loved. That conflict was the Vietnam War. As president, Johnson dramatically escalated America's involvement, believing it was a necessary fight to stop the spread of communism. He poured all of his formidable energy and political will into winning the war. But Alice, watching from Long Lee, saw a very different reality. She read the newspapers and watched the television reports, and she was horrified by the images of burning villages and the bodies of young American soldiers returning home in body bags. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Alice publicly positioned herself in direct opposition to Lyndon. She used her considerable influence in intellectual and artistic circles to speak out against the war. She hosted anti-war gatherings, signed petitions, and told everyone who would listen that the war was a terrible moral mistake. For President Johnson, this was an unforgivable act of betrayal. For Alice, the issue was no longer about love or loyalty, it was a battle between her conscience and his power. The man she had helped create was now using that power to cause death and destruction on a massive scale. The promise of a better America had turned into a waking nightmare, and their relationship was over. The final act, burning the letters. After Lyndon B. Johnson left the White House in 1969, a broken man harshly judged by history, their relationship was completely severed. He returned to his ranch in Texas, while Alice remained at Long Lee, living with her memories and her profound disappointment. Then, one day, she made her final decision. She walked through the silent rooms of her mansion, going to the library, the bedroom, and the attic, opening old boxes that had been stored away for years. She gathered everything, collecting the physical remnants of 25 years of their shared life, which were contained in stacks of handwritten letters. There were the passionate love letters from their early days, the sharp notes on political strategy, and the intimate confessions of their hopes and fears. These letters were the only tangible proof of one of the most secret and influential love affairs in American political history. Alice carried all of it to the large fireplace in the living room. She stood there alone in the quiet house as tears began to stream down her face. But she was not crying out of regret. She was mourning the man she had once loved, the man who, in her eyes, had died long before his body gave out. One by one, she took each letter, each piece of their shared past, and dropped it into the flames. She watched as the paper curled, turned black, and disintegrated into ash. As the fire consumed the very last letter, she whispered into the empty room, "The man I loved in 1937 is dead." This was not an act of revenge. It was her final act of love. By burning the letters, she was protecting her own integrity, her conscience, and her family from the dark shadow of a complicated history. She was erasing Lyndon B. Johnson from her life, not with hatred, but with a final, quiet judgment. He was no longer worthy of being remembered through the lens of the love she had once given him. An open ending, a powerful reflection. Lyndon B. Johnson passed away in 1973. Alice Glass lived a quiet life at Longleat until her death in 1976. After having personally destroyed every piece of physical evidence, she took their secret with her to the grave. All that remains of their story are second-hand accounts, fragmented pieces of a puzzle, and the empty spaces left behind by the fire. Their story leaves us with powerful questions that may never be answered. What does it truly say about Lyndon B. Johnson that the woman who loved him most fiercely, who dedicated a quarter of a century to building him, ultimately chose to burn every trace of him from her life? And is power really worth the price if it costs you the person who understood you best, the one who, in the end, wished to erase you completely from history?